So we're looking at Psalm 55 today and the emotion of fear. So verses 5 to 7 of Psalm 55 read, "Fear and trembling overwhelm me, and I can't stop shaking. Oh, that I had wings like a dove, then I would fly away and rest. I would fly far away." I can't read those words without thinking of little Jenny from the movie Forrest Gump, who, running away from her abusive home, whipping through the rows of corn, and dropping down to her knees, prays over and over again, "Dear God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far away from here. Dear God, please make me a bird so I can fly far, far away from here." Fear isn't always a bad thing, often is not a bad thing. Most often, fear protects us. The fear that Jenny felt likely, possibly saved her life. Fear is an emotion that gives rise to this impulse to flee. Last week we talked about anger, which is an emotion that gives rise to a similar energy but makes us want to fight. So both give us this energy either to fight or to flight. So for instance, if the common example is if you come across a bear, if you're face to face with a grizzly on a hiking trail in the Kananaskis, and you feel fear, that's a good thing. That could possibly save your life. Fear becomes problematic when it becomes making our world very small. For instance, fear of the potential of coming across a grizzly may rule out hiking altogether for you. Taking protective measures like learning about what to do when encountering a bear, or paying attention to park ranger reports, or taking along bear spray, all these things are not enough to make you even think about going hiking. And perhaps you don't like hiking anyway, so no big deal. The bigger deal is when we feel fear, but we need to restrain ourselves, restrain our impulse to flee. Like if you do face the grizzly and you think, I can flee the grizzly and I just need to run faster than my 5-year-old, that's not a good thing. But really, there are many situations in life in which we'll be afraid, and we need to fight that impulse to flee. And that's what we find here in Psalm 55. David feels the fear, but fights the impulse to flee the situation. So let's examine this fear that David feels. Starting at verse 1, David prays, "Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my cry for help. Please listen and answer me, for I am overwhelmed by my troubles. My enemies shout at me, making loud and wicked threats. They bring trouble on me and angrily hunt me down." And now listen to him describe what he feels. "My heart pounds in my chest. The terror of death assaults me. Fear and trembling overwhelm me, and I can't stop shaking." So we don't know the precise historical situation that David's in, but we do know the emotional situation he is in. We know the space he is in. We recognize it, don't we? I mean, it sounds like a panic attack, if I'm being honest. I am overwhelmed. My heart pounds in my chest. Terror of death assaults me. I can't stop shaking. And you'll notice in Psalm 55 that this particular feeling of fear arises from David noticing and being aware of this conflict that's in the city, this social unrest in the city. Verse 9, "For I see violence and conflict in the city. Its walls are patrolled day and night against invaders, but the real danger is wickedness within the city. Everything is falling apart. Threats and cheating are rampant in the streets." And what's worse is this reality touches close to home. This conflict, this social unrest comes between David and a close friend. He feels betrayed by a close friend. Verse 12, "It's not an enemy who taunts me. I could bear that. It's not my foes who so arrogantly insult me. I could have hidden from them. Instead, it is you, my equal, my companion and close friend. What good fellowship we once enjoyed as we walked together to the house of God." And so what's causing fear is this social unrest in the city, betrayal by people with whom David once worshiped. So here we focused so much time on warning and preparing ourselves for the wickedness in the world. We got blindsided by the wickedness within the walls of the worshiping community. We failed to have the resources within ourselves to manage well in the midst of our own fears. We began to betray each other. Will that be our story? Will our story be that we were destroyed by the fear within our own walls? So COVID, of course, brings up a lot of fear in just about everyone, not just some people, but just about everyone. We just have different fears. Some fear death, some fear financial ruin, others fear our rights are being taken away. Now, I don't consider it my job to tell you which of these fears are rational. Some fears are more rational than others, for sure. But my job is not to judge our fears, but to take our fears seriously and show how the psalmist responds to the fear that he is experiencing as a way forward for us, whatever our fear may be. And the first thing that the psalmist, David, does is express what he is tempted to do, what his impulse is to do in light of these fears that he feels. So here's what he's tempted to do. Verse 6, "Oh, that I had wings like a dove. Then I would fly away and rest. I would fly far away to the quiet of the wilderness. How quickly I would escape far from this wild storm of hatred." So in Israel, doves were known to fly out of the city into the wilderness, where they would find a nice place to perch in the crevices of the rocks on the hillsides. This is what David is imagining, how nice it would be to just fly away from the madness and just cozy up nicely in one of those rock crevices. It can be tempting to fly away, to flee the social unrest, whether it has to do with COVID or racial tensions or continued questions on human sexuality or continued environmental concerns, and then layer upon all this the continued suspicion of where the truth lies. Haven't we all felt the impulse to escape in some form or fashion? Whether it's, okay, I'm done with Facebook, signing off, see you on the other side. Or just go quiet in the conversations, go into a shell. That's how some of us escape. Some people actually literally do escape the city. They move to a small town away from the chaos, the storm. I just need some peace. Some leave for another church. Others will stay in the same spot, the same church, the same city, the same marriage, the same social networks, but will escape through drugs and alcohol. And some of those things are just good to do and perhaps necessary, but always worthy of examination. Is it fear that we're feeling, and is this fear giving rise to this impulse to flee, to escape? Because escape is not the answer. As followers of Jesus Christ, we above all ought to know this. Because Jesus entered into the chaos of the world, he doesn't escape it, but entered into it, entering the chaos of violence and wickedness with the resources of the life-giving power of God to reverse the chaos. This is the biblical view of redemption. It's that God and those who are on mission with him enter the storm, not escape it. Now, I think it should be said that while escaping is not the answer, we ought to give grace to those of us for whom an escape is necessary for a time. Sometimes we do need to recognize our own humanness, and we need some refuge for a time. Escape can be a temporary solution, a healthy measure, but ultimately, the chaos can't be defeated by escape. The chaos can't be reversed by the church who shelters themselves from the conversation, from the world. Even the flood didn't destroy the wickedness of the world, because the wickedness was also within Noah and his family, who were spared. Noah and his family were sheltered from the storm, kept safe in the ark, but the wickedness was also inside the ark. We can have guards on the outside of the city to prevent the storm from coming in, but the wickedness is also inside the city. The chaos is inside the worshiping community. The chaos is inside each of us, if we're being real. And so escape isn't an option. Escape can never be a long-term, sustainable solution in dealing with the chaos, with the conflict. That impulse to flee from the chaos, from conflict, is an impulse motivated by fear, and it's love that will propel us to enter back into the chaos of the city for the sake of the city. Perfect love casts out fear, says John. Perfect love drove Jesus into the center of the storm for the sake of those being ravaged by the storm. Perfect love drove Jesus into the chaos of the city for the sake of the city. And Jesus felt fear. We're not wrong to feel fear. Jesus felt the fear and was actually tempted to escape. In the garden, he was sweating blood and shedding tears, praying to his Father, "Let this cup pass from me. If there's any way, let this cup pass from me." Jesus felt the fear. But in his fear, he fled to his Father, and in his Father, he found the resources to continue on with the resolve that, "Father, your will be done." And this is what David does too in this psalm. After feeling the fear and then feeling the impulse to escape the situation, David ultimately chooses to flee to God. Verse 16, "But I will call on God, and the Lord will rescue me. Morning, noon, and night, I cry out in my distress, and the Lord hears my voice." One commentator puts it nicely. The answer is not fleeing from the situation, but calling God into the situation. And David does this with diligence. Morning, noon, and night, I cry out to God in distress. And I know this can seem trite and maybe even unhelpful to say to someone who is in a very difficult situation, go to God. Call God into the situation. Go to God. Cast your cares upon Jesus. But bear a few things in mind, if you will. 3 things. First, David and the other psalmists and many others in the Bible who do give this advice to cast your anxiety, your fear upon the Lord, have experienced deep pain and distress themselves. And so this advice does not come from a naive person who hasn't received glimpses of hell. And saints across the centuries who themselves give this advice too have suffered unimaginable pain. And they tell us, in your pain, go to God, it helps. Let the wisdom of those who have experienced much suffering through their days, let them counsel you. David, for instance, is the opposite of trite in that he actually feels the pain. He actually expresses the pain. He knows the pain deeply, and he counsels, call out to God in your distress. He will rescue you. And second, to bear in mind, going to Jesus with your anxiety, with your fears, going to Jesus should not be seen as being in competition with other action taken. For example, if you have debilitating anxiety, going to Jesus should not be presented as diametrically opposed to taking medication for your anxiety. In your anxiety, go to Jesus, but also take your medication. Going to Jesus is not a competing option to taking medication. If you break your leg, go to Jesus to help you get through the coming weeks. But also, get a cast on your leg. Going to Jesus is not a competing option to going to the hospital. If we have fear of COVID, go to Jesus in faith to carry you through this time with proper perspective and ultimate hope. But also, follow the safety protocols. Faith in Jesus is not a competing option to trusting experts in medicine and science. And so, for example, when we resume worship in-person gathering here, we will unveil a litany of safety protocols even as we worship Jesus with a litany of praise. Third thing to bear in mind as you hear somebody possibly advise and counsel you to go to Jesus with your fears. Going to Jesus does not mean the trouble will go away. David in verse 18 says, "He ransoms me and keeps me safe from the battle waged against me. Though many still oppose me." So God is with me. He protects me. The threat is still there. I still need to deal with it. So even though God keeps me safe and is with me, the threat remains there. It's not gone away. And Jesus doesn't say that coming to him will make the trouble go away. He says this, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." So let's not nurture any false expectations that calling upon God will make our trouble disappear. If we do nurture those false expectations, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment and perhaps even loss of faith down the road because we've been sold a false bill of sale. Calling upon Jesus won't make the trouble go away. We call upon God to give us the resources to walk through the storm. Maybe he will take away the trouble, but it should not be an expectation. So then, what does calling upon Jesus actually do? How is this helpful? Why do the seasoned saints advise it? Because God is bigger than your greatest fear, more powerful. He will outlast your biggest fear. In other words, God should be feared more than your biggest fear. And when we do fear God, our debilitating fears, because fearing God ought not be a debilitating fear, but when we fear God, our debilitating fears lose their oxygen. They are less likely to thrive. So to fear God means to give God the reverence fitting of being the one who holds your life in his hands. To fear God means to give God the reverence fitting of being the one who holds the future in his hands. And when we intentionally spend time fixing our gaze, our adoration, our respect, our love upon this God, the God who holds us and our future in his hands, our fears are put into perspective. Our fears are less likely to distort our view of reality, because that is what unhealthy fears do. They distort reality. They make us think that we aren't capable. They bring us despair. They keep us in bed, so to speak. And people who seek to invoke that fear in us, this is what they are doing. They want to make something seem bigger than it is so that they can have their way with us. This is why you see in Fight the System movies about characters that need to fight the system, so to speak. Usually the protagonist has to come to believe that she or he is not as helpless as the system made them feel. So for instance, an abusive company will make the character feel that he needs this company. Without us, you won't survive. They sing along with King George III from Hamilton. What comes next? When push comes to shove, you'll be back. You'll be back. Abusive husbands sing the same song. They seek to invoke fear. Why? Because fear distorts our perception of what is possible. And when we sit in the presence of the God who holds us and the future in his hands, when we fear this God, when we give this God the reverence fitting of the person who holds our life and the future in his hands, who has promised us a future in the city where there is no social unrest, in the city where there is no longer pain or suffering or tears. When we fear this God, all our other fears begin to suffocate. Now, this isn't to say that if we feel fear, we're being unfaithful or unspiritual. A faithful person can very well feel the fear, like Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. A faithful person struggles with the fear, faces the fear. Just means that the person is being transparent about the human struggle to go to God. Conversely, It could be that I feel no fear because I'm not facing the fear. I fled the fear, so I'm perfectly at peace. The struggle, the goal, is when you feel the fear and that impulse to flee, use that energy to flee to God. Let your fear of God, the one who will make all things well, give perspective to all other fears. In Christ, God makes all things well. Sitting in the presence of the God who will bring completion to the making all things well helps us breathe. It helps us sing. Even in the midst of our fears and in the midst of the ones who seek to invoke those debilitating fears, it helps us sing to them a different kind of song. Helps us sing songs like this refrain from this famous hymn. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. Let's pray. Father, thank you that in your Son, Christ, we are able to live, that we have life, that we have future life, that all things will be well, that we will one day see you face to face, and our joy will be complete. Help us now, even now, for our joy to become more and more complete. May your joy be within us, and may you demolish that fear that stands in the way of this joy being realized. Amen.